Chapter 1. The Tale and the Stranger. The clamor of blaring alarms reverberated through the metal walls of the orbital station. The sound relentless reminder of the chaos unfolding outside. The hum of the starship engines pulsed beneath Ethan Cade's boots, blending with the distant crackle of gunfire and the sharp, staccato rhythm of his own heartbeat. He had never signed up for this. A simple engineer, grounded in the dust of Earth, never imagined he'd be tangled up in an interstellar evacuation, a war zone far above the planet he called home. Ethan stumbled through the dimly lit corridor, the blinking emergency lights casting strange shadows over his face. The smell of ozone mingled with the sharp scent of alien flora, odd, sweet, like the perfume of some distant planet he'd never been to. Panic twisted in his gut, but it was the alien that really had his heart racing. She was waiting in the emergency bay, curled in on herself, her silvery blue skin glowing faintly in the half-light. Selari, the fox-tailed diplomat's daughter, had always seemed untouchable, graceful, poised, a creature born in the halls of alien royalty. Now, she was crouched low, her large ears flicking nervously in the direction of the incoming bombardment. Her tail was the first thing Ethan noticed as he approached, a sleek, translucent plume of shimmering white fur, twitching and flicking behind her like a live thing. It swished uneasily, brushing against the cold floor as she turned her head to meet his gaze. "Are you lost, human?" she asked, her voice a smooth, melodic purr that almost sounded too calm for the chaos around them. She didn't seem surprised to see him. No doubt she had expected him to find his way here, as if fate itself had nudged him forward. Ethan shook his head, his breath quick and shallow. "Not lost, just trying to stay alive. Looks like we're both in the wrong place at the wrong time." Selari's amber eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel oddly exposed. She stood then, a fluid motion that was almost unnatural, like a predator poised to strike. He had seen the way her people moved, graceful, unnervingly so. Her species had evolved to survive in harsh alien environments, but here, in the belly of the station, with bombs falling from the sky, even she seemed vulnerable. "I'm not sure your kind is equipped for this, human," she remarked, glancing around at the dimmed emergency lighting in a tight space that would soon become a death trap. "You are small, fragile, and yet you're still here." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the heat of frustration rise up inside him. He was used to being underestimated by aliens, a side effect of his human nature. But he wasn't going to take it. Not now. "We're not as fragile as you think," he muttered, the word harsh and low, as he started to move toward the nearby control panel. The metallic surface of the station creaked as it shifted, like the entire structure was groaning under the strain of the bombardment. The sound of the stars outside, fast, bright explosions against the black of space, flickered in his ears. A loud boom rattled the walls, and Selari flinched, her tail snapping around her like a whip. Ethan barely had time to react when the bright flash of incoming enemy fire lit the bay, and he was suddenly pressed against her, instinctively shielding her from the blast. Her tail curled tightly around his waist, soft yet firm, like a living shield. He felt the rush of her heartbeat, fast, against his chest. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, his mind whirring, trying to make sense of the chaos, trying to remember how to breathe. But in that moment, he knew something else. This was real. Her tail didn't loosen. Instead, it tightened, a bizarre, vulnerable kind of protection. "Are you always this blunt?" she asked, her breath barely a whisper as she pulled away slightly but kept close. Ethan's lips curled into a half-smile. "You've got a tail. I've got my hands. Seems fair, don't you think?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with the unspoken understanding. Above, the stars burned in their indifferent silence, but inside the station, amidst the hum of engines and the crackling firestorm of war, something else was beginning to ignite between them, the first spark of something neither had expected. Chapter 2. Strangers in the Market of Stars. The faint tremor of the station's emergency systems hummed beneath Ethan's boots as he and Selari made their way through the narrow corridors. The air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone and something else, strange, sweet, like an alien flower on the verge of bloom. It was hard to keep track of time in the frantic, disorienting chaos, but Ethan knew one thing for sure. He had no idea where they were going. Selari was his guide, though, and for the first time, he had no choice but to trust her. The fox-tailed alien, usually so composed and regal, moved with a swift urgency, her tail flicking anxiously behind her, brushing the walls with a soft, shimmering glow. She didn't speak as they hurried through the winding maze of corridors, an odd silence between them that spoke volumes. They reached a low-hanging hatch, its surface scratched and battered from years of use. As Selari placed her slender fingers on the interface, a low hum filled the air, followed by the sharp hiss of the doors sliding open. Beyond was a sight that made Ethan's heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The Market of Stars was everything he had imagined 1,000 times, and nothing like he expected. The sprawling space station marketplace was a chaotic blend of cultures, each stall and booth a patchwork of neon lights, holographic projections, and alien vendors hawking their wares. Above them, the ceiling arced into a shimmering vault of translucent material, revealing an artificial night sky that flickered with distant stars. The very air seemed alive, buzzed with the mingling hum of multiple languages, the trill of unknown creatures, and the faint thrum of alien music. Ethan squinted, trying to adjust to the overwhelming blend of colors and sounds. There were flickering displays of holographic food, alien fruits, floating liquids, meats from planets he couldn't even name. Strange fabrics shimmered in the light, like silk woven from starlight. But it wasn't the sight or sound that stunned him, it was the scent. Ethan inhaled deeply, tasting the strange, perfumed air. It was sweet, like honeyed fruit, and something musky, like a scent he'd smelled in a jungle once, far from Earth. His eyes locked on a vendor selling glass jars filled with liquid that glowed a soft green. The air was heavy with spices and unfamiliar, pungent herbs. "Come." Selari's voice snapped him from his reverie, and he followed her, distracted by the blur of movement in the crowd. A humanoid alien with a serpentine neck passed by, a mask of shimmering scales reflecting the neon light. A trio of insectoid traders bargained with a sleek, four-armed vendor, the clack of their clicking mandibles adding to the chorus of sound. The crowd was vast, alien species of all shapes and sizes, a living testament to the diversity of the galaxy. But in the center of it all, Selari seemed so small. She guided him past an open-air stall where a vendor peddled living plants, their tendrils reaching out as if alive. One of them brushed against his cheek, and he flinched, pulling away. It felt like a whisper of some strange, unspoken language. Selari smirked, but it wasn't in a mocking way. "You should try the fruit there." She pointed toward a vendor, his stall glowing with citrus-like bulbs that floated, shimmering. The fruit shifted colors, as though alive. "It's a delicacy from my home planet." Ethan hesitated. He had never been fond of alien food, let alone glowing fruit. But there was a challenge in her eyes, a curiosity, a dare. Selari, the untouchable diplomat's daughter, had seen more of the universe in her short lifetime than Ethan could ever hope to. Yet here she was, offering him something as mundane as food. Something human. He shrugged, a wry smile crossing his face. "All right, but if I end up in a hospital, you're paying for the medical bills." Selari raised an eyebrow, but she said nothing, only handing him a piece of fruit that shimmered and hummed in his palm. He bit into it, sweet, tangy, and soft, the taste of bursts of unfamiliar flavors that somehow felt like home. They continued walking through the market, but a strange tension settled in the air. It wasn't the chaos of the market or the alien merchants. They could handle that. It was something between them, something unspoken. I didn't think humans would be so curious. Selari's voice was a soft, almost imperceptible murmur beneath the noise, like she was testing the waters. Her tail twitched, brushing against his leg before she quickly drew it back, embarrassed. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the change in tone. For once, her usual ice-cold composure seemed fractured. There was a vulnerability in her stance, in the way she avoided his gaze. "I've always been curious about everything," Ethan said. His voice was lighter now, and he offered her a small grin. "You might say it's a human trait." "Curiosity," she repeated, her lips curving in a soft, contemplative smile. "It's an interesting quality. Not many species possess it." She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. "Some find it dangerous." "Not for us," Ethan said with a half shrug, eyes flicking over the bustling crowds around them. "We've survived because we keep asking questions. The more we ask, the more we learn." Selari glanced at him for a brief moment before her gaze shifted back to the marketplace. A silence stretched between them, this time more comfortable. It wasn't just the alien tech, the foreign foods, or the diverse species that intrigued Ethan. It was a strange alien culture, the way Selari was now sharing it with him, if only in small ways. Humans had always prided themselves on their adaptability. But here, in the midst of intergalactic politics and the alien marketplace, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one out of place. Still, something about it felt right, like he was finally stepping into the unknown. Ethan shrugged, the words feeling too simple for what they meant. "It's just how we are. We don't hide behind politics or status. If we want something, we go after it." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward anymore. It was a kind of quiet that was full of possibility, as if something had shifted in the air around them. "Well then, human," Selari said, her voice now steady, almost playful. "I suppose we'll see just how far your directness takes us." And for the first time, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just helping her survive. He was showing her how to live, outside the shadows of her family, outside the control that had bound her for so long. And in the distance, the stars kept their watch, burning bright, as they drifted deeper into the unknown. Chapter 4, The Fire in the Void. The freighter was drifting in the dark, the hum of the engines had become a low, mournful whine as they passed through a debris field, the scattered wreckage of ships long forgotten. It was an eerie silence that wrapped itself around Ethan, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors as he made his way to the main control room. Outside, the endless void of space stretched on, empty and suffocating. Ethan was used to the hum of engines, the vibration of ships under his feet, but tonight, something was different. The faint tremors in the freighter system seemed to be a warning, a subtle prelude to the violence that was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The air was thick with tension, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He arrived at the control room to find Selari hunched over a console, her sleek figure illuminated by the flickering lights of the malfunctioning panels. Her face was set, her tail still and rigid behind her. She didn't even glance up as he entered, her attention focused entirely on the readouts in front of her. "Still no word from the rest of the fleet?" Ethan asked, his voice rough in the silence. "No," Selari replied, her voice tight, controlled. "We're alone, completely cut off. The fleet is miles away, too far to reach us before they hit us." Her words hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't the thought of their impending doom that gnawed at him. It was something else, something more personal. He could sense in the way she carried herself, an unspoken fear, a vulnerability she refused to show. Ethan leaned against the console, crossing his arms. "What's really going on, Selari? You've been quiet for hours." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped a few buttons on the panel, bringing up a holographic display of their current position in space. A dark, swirling nebula loomed on the edge of their route, an impenetrable field of gas and dust that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. "I've been thinking," she said finally, her tone softer now. "Thinking about what comes next. What happens when we run out of options?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "We'll figure something out. We always do." "I'm not so sure," Selari whispered, almost to herself. Her tail curled up over her shoulder, the soft fur glowing faintly in the dim light. "I've never been so helpless before." Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, an instinctive gesture of comfort. It was rare to see Selari so unguarded, and he wasn't sure if she would pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. "We'll survive," he said, his voice firm, as much for himself as for her. "We're humans. We're made to survive." Selari turned her head slightly, her amber eyes meeting his. There was a softness there now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the ship lurched, throwing both of them off balance. The sudden movement threw Ethan into the console, the harsh impact stealing the breath from his lungs. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the walls. The hum of the engines intensified, then died altogether, leaving them in eerie silence. "Shit," Ethan muttered, rubbing his sore ribs. "What was that?" Solari's gaze snapped to the viewport. "They're here." The enemy ships had arrived. Through the window, Ethan saw them, a swarm of sleek, black vessels, cutting to the void like predators closing in on their prey. The flashing red lights of their weapon systems illuminated the darkness as they began their descent toward the freighter. "We're sitting ducks," Ethan shouted, his pulse quickening. He moved toward the control panel, fingers flying over the buttons in a frantic attempt to bring the ship's defenses online. "Damn it, come on, come on." Selari didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at the screen with a detached calmness that seemed almost unnatural. Her eyes flickered back to the map, where the enemy ships were already locking onto their position. "Selari?" Ethan's voice was sharp, a crack of panic breaking through the facade of control. "What do we do?" "We fight," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. She turned toward him, her expression hardening. "You said it yourself. We survive." Before Ethan could respond, the freighter jolted again, and a loud, metallic screech echoed through the hull. Explosions rang out in the distance, the first salvo of the enemy's assault. Ethan didn't hesitate this time. He pulled open a nearby compartment, his hands moving with practiced precision to grab a blaster. He tossed a second one to Selari, who caught it without a flinch. There was no time to explain the finer details of space combat. There was only the moment. The ship shuddered violently as enemy fire rocked the freighter, the tremors sending debris flying. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward the nearest corridor, eyes scanning for any sign of enemy boarders. His fingers tightened around the blaster's grip. "We need to get to the engine room," he said, his voice low, tense. "If we can't fight them off, we'll at least make sure they don't get what they want." Solari's tail flicked behind her, her eyes narrowing. "I've already sent a distress signal, but there's no guarantee anyone will reach us in time." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening as he moved ahead, leading the way through the darkened halls. The sound of distant blasts echoed, each one vibrating through his bones. Selari was right behind him, moving with the same silent determination. The tension between them had shifted once more, something unspoken hanging in the air between their exchanged glances. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting for each other. And as the door to the engine room slid open with a hiss, they were met with the cold, unyielding reality of the battle ahead. There was no turning back now. The stars outside continued to burn, indifferent to the firestorm raging within. Chapter 5. When the Tails Embrace. The freighter's hull shuddered again, the metallic groan of the ship straining against a barrage of enemy fire. Ethan's boots scraped against the narrow floor of the corridor, his pulse hammering in his ears, drowning out the hum of the emergency lights above him. His breath came in short, controlled bursts as he moved toward the ship's rear, where the engine room awaited. Every step felt like a ticking clock. He had no idea how long they had before the ship was completely incapacitated. They had to reach the engine core, the beating heart of the freighter, and keep the enemy from taking it. Beside him, Selari moved with the same focused precision, her golden eyes scanning their surroundings with an intensity that made her appear far more alien than she truly was. Her tail flicked nervously behind her, the soft, translucent fur glowing faintly in the dim lighting as they hurried through the darkened hallways. Despite the battle raging around them, Selari's movements were eerily calm, as though her mind had already anticipated the worst. And then, without warning, they heard it. Footsteps. Not human. Too light, too measured. Selari's head snapped toward the corner, just as two alien soldiers, clad in dark, form-fitting armor, emerged from the shadows. Ethan reached for his blaster instinctively, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. The first shot hit one of the soldiers square in the chest, sending it sprawling backward. The second soldier's weapon fired, the blast crackling through the air just inches from Ethan's face. He dove behind a bulkhead, adrenaline surging. Selari didn't hesitate. Her tail snapped like a whip, its fur shimmering brightly as she sprang into action, her movements a blur of grace and deadly intent. A flick of her wrist sent a plasma blade materializing from her gauntlet, and she slashed it with a fluid, practiced motion. The blade cut through the air like a streak of lightning, and the second soldier crumpled to the floor in a heap. Ethan stared, momentarily stunned. She was lethal, a warrior born of another world. For a brief second he saw not the diplomat's daughter, but fighter, a creature of instinct and survival. "Get moving," Selari said, her voice sharp as she holstered her blade, her eyes scanning the hall for any more threats. She didn't even break a sweat. "We can't waste time." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Right." They continued toward the engine room, their pace quickening as the oppressive silence of the ship was shattered by distant explosions and the low, rhythmic thrum of enemy fire against the hull. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. As they reached the engine room's access hatch, Selari paused, her fingers hovering over the control panel. The faint glow of her tail illuminated the small space around them, casting long shadows on the metal walls. She glanced over at Ethan, her gaze unreadable. "There's no going back after this," she said, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than it had been before. "If we override the core's lock, it could damage the entire engine. We may not even be able to escape in time." Ethan's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that fueled him. It was something else, something he couldn't name, but he knew it when he saw it in Selari's eyes. There was trust there now. Maybe not full trust, but something close. She had let him in just a little, and it was enough to make the difference. "Then we do what we have to do," Ethan said, stepping closer to her. The words came out raw, but they were honest, and for the first time since they'd met, he meant them. "We fight. We survive." Solari's gaze softened, and for a split second, she looked human. No longer just a diplomat's daughter, the coldly composed alien princess, but a woman bound by the same instincts to live, to protect. Her tail curled once around his leg, softly, protectively, and it was a gesture so simple, yet so profound that it left Ethan momentarily speechless. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself, and pressed a sequence of buttons on the console. The hatch slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the chaos within. The engine room was massive, a labyrinth of twisted metal, exposed wires, and glowing power cores that hummed with life. The faint glow of the engines pulsed in rhythm with their hearts, the deep rumble of the core reverberating through the entire ship. But even that did little to mask the damage. Sparks flew from fractured panels, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt ozone. Ethan's eyes immediately locked onto the central control terminal. He could see the emergency lockdown was already in place, the system primed to shut the core down completely in the event of an attack. That was their window. If they could breach the lock, they could send the engines into overdrive, buying themselves enough time to escape the attacking fleet. Selari, Ethan said, his voice low, urgent. We need to get to that terminal, now. But Selari didn't respond. Instead, she moved past him, her body shifting fluidly as she made her way to the far end of the room. She tapped a few controls on a secondary panel, and for a moment, everything stopped. The engines hummed slowed, and the emergency lights flickered before the entire room was bathed in an eerie blue glow. Done. She spoke without turning, her tone calm but firm. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise as he watched the massive engine spring to life, the power flowing to the freighter like a surge of adrenaline. He could see the readings on the terminal. Thrusters active, engines at 70% capacity, and then, warning, core breach imminent. The red lights blinked to life across the engine room, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The temperature in the room shot up as the engines fought to stabilize under the strain. "We're not out yet," he muttered, gritting his teeth. "Not yet," Selari agreed. But her eyes met his then, and there was no longer any hesitation. No more cold, distant diplomat. There was a shared understanding between them now. She moved toward him, and without thinking, her tail curled around his waist again. This time, it was no longer out of instinct or desperation. It was an embrace, a silent promise that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered, her voice warm in his ear as the engines roared to life. "We can make it out of this. Together." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. The ship was alive with a hum of power, but it wasn't just the engines that were starting to roar. It was him, too. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Not now. Not ever. "We will," he whispered back. And with that, the last of the hatch's barriers slid open, revealing the vast expanse of space beyond, where the enemy ships loomed, ready to strike. But this time they were ready. And as the bombs fell around them, Ethan and Selari, bound by their trust, stepped into the firestorm, their hearts beating in unison against the chaos of the void. Chapter 6, The Human Promise. The stars stretched before them like a cold, indifferent sea, their distant light cutting through the darkness of space. The freighter, battered but functional, drifted quietly toward the fringes of the neutral star station, a lone speck against a vast, inhospitable expanse. Inside the vessel, the low hum of the engines was a constant reminder that they had survived, barely. The damage had been extensive, the cost high, but they had made it. Ethan Cade leaned against the viewport, his fingers tracing the cold metal as he stared out into the abyss. The soft thrum of the ship's power core filled the silence, the rhythmic pulse grounding him the moment. But his mind raced, never truly still. He couldn't shake the sense of what had been lost and what they had gained. Behind him, Selari stood near the console, her posture regal once more. Though her usual poise had softened, a certain weariness now etched in her every movement. Her tail flicked behind her, still glowing faintly in the dim light. But there was something different about her now, something not just physical but emotional. An openness that hadn't been there before, one that seemed to reach toward him, pulling him closer with each passing moment. The ship's alert lights flickered briefly, and then the soft voice of the station's communications officer crackled through the speakers. "Freighter Echoes Dawn," the voice said, sterile but somehow warm. You are cleared for docking at Station Orion's edge. Welcome." She reached out then, a slow, deliberate movement. Her hand, soft and warm, brushed against his, the touch lingering just long enough to make his pulse quicken. Without a word, her tail curled around his leg, the fur brushing against the skin in the most delicate, intimate way. She had done it before, a reflex of comfort or defense, but this time it was a choice. "You're right," she whispered, her lips just a breath away from his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. "You've taught me that, Ethan. Together, we can face anything." Ethan's heart pounded, and for the first time since they'd met, he let himself believe it, too. They could survive this together, the station, the galaxy, everything that stood in their way. It didn't matter anymore. They had each other, and that was enough. "Then let's make them remember us." He said the words with a fierce determination, as though declaring war on everything that tried to tear them apart. Selari gave him a soft, knowing smile. "I think I'm starting to understand what it means to be human." Her voice was full of wonder, but it wasn't pity. It was respect. The freighter drifted toward the docking bay of Station Orion's edge, the bright lights of the station now visible in the distance, signaling their final destination. But as they prepared for whatever awaited them, Ethan and Selari knew one thing for certain. No matter the outcome, they found something more valuable than survival. They had found each other, and that was worth fighting for. The starship drifted quietly in the orbit of forgotten world, its engines humming softly beneath the worn metal. Outside the viewport, the vast expanse of space stretched endlessly, dotted with constellations unfamiliar and distant, their lights flickering like distant dreams. Neon lights from nearby stations shimmered, casting a soft glow that mingled with the artificial gravity's gentle hum, a reminder that they had survived against all odds. Ethan stood at the observation window, his hands braced against the cool glass. The scars of battle, the way of their journey, had not left him unchanged. His mind replayed the hardships, the sacrifices, but was a silence now that rang loudest in his ears. They had won, somehow, against the darkness of space, and yet it was this silence that told him the real victory lay not in survival, but in what they had become. Behind him, Selari approached, her footfalls quiet against the deck. Her eyes, once filled with distrust and wariness, now softened with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name but understood all the same. Her tail curled gently around his leg, the delicate touch speaking louder than words ever could. "You were right," she said softly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the ship. "It was never about power. It was about us, about what we're willing to fight for." Ethan turned to her, his chest tight. He reached out, cupping her face gently, the bond between them stronger now than ever. "It's always been about this," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "about fighting for the people who matter." Selari smiled, a warmth in her eyes that reached deep into his soul. "Then let's keep fighting for each other, for the future we'll make." With one final shared look at the distant stars, they knew that no matter what came next, their journey together had already made them something extraordinary, something uniquely human.